All right, welcome to the Kube Agentic networking meeting for December 4th. Got a couple good topics on the agenda today. I think we usually try and keep track of attendees here, so if you don't mind adding your names so we have a better track of who this meeting is working for, that'd be incredibly helpful. Yeah. And with that, Guy, I think you're up first. Let's talk. I've been looking at this, and I think I even started a review and just failed to leave the comments yet. You know how it's just like starts to collect, and then I got pulled away. But yeah, Guy, why don't you? What do you think are the areas worth talking about here, or most relevant?
Yeah. Well, many people shared some feedback on that pull request. So thank you so much for everybody who did it. And but for context, this is a I'm going to call it an extension. It's extension rather than an alternative to the tool authorization API for the use case where rather than having the permissions statically defined in the policies, users want to integrate and connect some other systems into the authorization piece, right? For example, they already have their identities managed by identity providers, and that already provide mechanisms such as for dynamic client registration, this kind of thing, and maybe some grouping mechanism. And now they only need to integrate those into the authorization policy to be able to verify those identities at request time and maybe enforce some simpler authorization rules based on some pattern matchings, right? So that is the main idea. And I'm bringing this up here because even though we've been discussing about this for quite some time now, this is probably the best opportunity for people to start sharing some more structured feedback. Because so far it has been on top of that other proposal that has been progressing well, but without any explanation, any proper text, that laying out the exact idea of this. Yeah, go ahead, Rob.
Cool. So what I was most interested in this proposal, and I know there's been a fair amount of discussion around this, so I'm not unique here, is, and I guess it dates back to an earlier PR as well, is using Kubernetes RBAC feels risky to me. And I know, like, your points here are that that this is something that already exists in Kubernetes. So providing a way to use a tool that already exists for authorization, I see the rationale for it. With that said, at least the way I've looked at, and I think many at GK have looked at, Kube API servers, that although it should be high availability, I'm very hesitant to put it, as a blocking, a blocker for any requests, any traffic that is going through seemingly unrelated paths, right? API server can be highly available, but even then, it's likely not as available as an independent proxy could be. So this was the biggest thing to me that I really wanted to talk more about, and I'm sure I have some comments drafted somewhere about it, but yeah, that was the most interesting part for me.
Yeah, I think that is a fair point, and you're not alone, right? I think John and Keith, they both, shared, similar thoughts in the pull request, maybe other people as well before that. And as I said, I think that this is fair, right? even though there are ways, to circumvent that problem of overloading the API server, which nowadays comes with a very sophisticated way for managing seat availability, right, and quota, in a way that you can really define priorities and make sure that there's no elephant, as they describe, will smash any rat, right, any mouse in the requests to the API server. I can see how not all implementations would feel comfortable with committing with this idea, which I think it's a fair point, right? In the end, we want to make users' lives easier, but also we need the commitment of the implementations to this, right? If they are not ready for it, so what's the point? Luckily, David, who I don't think it's in the call today, he shared a very interesting design that could be a way out where we wouldn't force any implementation to support all those different authentication authorization methods, but rather having them all as not vendor specific, but methods that different vendors could opt in, right? So I think David even shared a diagram, which I found very interesting. I think Lior was the one commenting on that diagram. So thanks for that, Lior.
Is that in this PR somewhere? Sorry.
It is.
Yeah, but not in the files view.
Okay.
Yeah, there's.
I think I've seen this. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
you probably need
this
to zoom
is
out.
the current state of things. Yes, and the next one would be David's proposal. So he described it as vendor extensions, right? So I don't know how you all feel about this, but it would be a way with more, relational kind of links between the different kinds of resources to model authorization for the use case that we want to tackle here, and yet not force any implementations necessarily to implement all the different types that we want to support. I see a few hands up, so.
I'm never sure who's first, but I think Bowie, it was you.
I just have a question, because this is, I think, as I understand, this project is somewhat in the gateway API space. Is the gateway like extended, kind of the feature division between core, extended, and experimental? Like, is that applied to these? Because this feels like you're describing the extended feature. I'm asking because I don't know what kind of support we're discussing.
That's an excellent question. Yeah, it could be done that way, except that the extended thing is, at least the way I saw it in Gateway API, would imply that those types are defined as part of the API, right? So you still would say the type is Kubernetes auth, but it's extended. So you may opt not to implement that, right? While the model proposed by David, if I understood it correctly, it would be slightly different. So you could in a provider ref, you could reference any kind of object, any GVK, right? So it could be something that only has meaning for that particular implementation, and it's completely abstracted at the level of the core API. But I think both things could work here.
Leo, I think it's you. Or
yeah. Well, I had, but I see Bowie's hands. Like, do you want to follow up on this, Bowie, or I had a different question?
Yeah. So I think it's interesting you say that, because sort of if it's not discussed in this group, then, like, for example, any vendor, as long as they obey the semantics of like the rest of the API, can always add, for example, if it's like a referenced thing, right? They can always add a meaning for their own thing. But for at least how I've always understood it from the Gateway API perspective, it's like the extended makes sense to discuss because we all like, broadly speaking, agree on the meaning of, for example, I'll just pick one, like cell authorization policy. Like, we don't see that there's going to be a different kind of cell authorization policy for every vendor. And that's all.
No, yeah, that's a good point. And I have no personal preference. Right? In fact, the original proposal, the current text, if you go, I was all in with the idea of having all those methods as part of the main API, right? If we want to make it as an extended kind of feature using gateway API terminology, I think that works. No problem. And that other one proposed by David, I mean, also works. But it's maybe relatively weaker in the sense that the auth scheme CRD in this case would be nothing but a bunch of references, right, to the backend and to the corresponding identity verification authorization rules. So it would serve the purpose of modeling an end-to-end kind of relationship, I suppose.
So yeah, to this point, I'm actually interested in like, so there's two things. There's the first question, which I was interested about, like how much you are getting from the implementations you're working with, the appetite for this RBAC, which was my first question, but I'm gonna start with my second question, which I'm actually wondering whether this extensibility patterns, right, and in order to avoid this, like a weak API, the way you described it, whether the extensibility patterns can be somehow integrated within the access policy, as an example, or actually like one resource where we have just as a random reference point, right? Like as an HTTP, right now HTTP route, right now we have like this. We had this reference point, which is like extension ref. Now we, so I'm wondering if there's any way this pluggability can be within the same resource.
Yeah, to your first point, Leo, I'm trying to basically just follow the same model we use for the access policy, where we try to avoid that question, right? Of going to the implementations first, and seeing how many would be interested. Not that we don't care, but I'm just saying that the idea here is just focusing on.
Sorry to cut you off. You're right. Like I didn't mean implementations. Actually, I wanted to ask like about users, right? The users care about. Yeah,
that is 100% backed by experience,
yeah, I know it is.
collected from the field. Yeah,
I know it is. I know you didn't bring it up. I just wanted to know like what's the arguments for RBAC. I mean, I know for me at least it's kind of new. I mean, in a way that I hear the appetite there, but like I just wanted to, because obviously if you kind of provide this like a very short, I don't want it to take all the meaning, but a very short background of like the arguments you're hearing for like why RBAC is the the preferred or convenience solution for people to rely on. It can be interesting as well.
Yeah, I made sure to include a section in the document, trying to list the main reasons why users usually, when they are presented with this option, they consider Kubernetes RBAC as an interesting, approach, for modeling authorization for network traffic as well. Maybe they are not as concerned about the overloading the API server and all the other caveats that we mentioned. Not that they shouldn't, they definitely should. But I'm just saying that there are also reasons to do so, and I try to capture some of those. I won't, spend too much time on here. I mean, I can point you to the section in the document where we describe. But Rob already mentioned the fact that it's an API that the users are familiar with already, right? So it's the same language that the users otherwise use for modeling permissions for other stuff in Kubernetes. So that's one. If you think about it, the way we model the access policy, it's just a different way, to represent permissions. It's saying this principal can access this resource, right? That is something that you already have a way to represent in Kubernetes. So it's what we're doing here is just recognizing that as the one way one would want to to represent those permissions in the cluster instead of having two different ways to do the same thing, right? So that's one. But there are other reasons as well.
Yeah.
And to your second.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, go for me second.
Yeah, you had a second point on, and I know Rob may have comments on this first one, but very quickly, I added myself, a bullet point because, yeah, it looks like that could be an opportunity to merge those two proposals again into one, right? How we at some point we considered doing. So yeah, instead of having all access policy and all scheme, if we are gonna use the extension ref thing, yeah, we could try to accommodate that instead of the access policy API. I don't see why we wouldn't.
Yeah, and then like I think anyway, yeah, I'll let Rob speak, but I think it's an interesting path to explore, like how the extension point would be there. Yeah.
So I'm really interested in extension wrap. That's something like that, or some kind of extensibility here. That's something that has proven very valuable in Gateway API so far. Actually, I think Quadrant has probably taken extensibility the furthest. So you're more than familiar with that, and I'm sure probably wish we had better extensibility points. What I'm curious about with this is this something that you would expect to be different per identity, like the method, or is this kind of just the implementation as a whole uses OIDC? Or is this really something that needs to be per rule, or should we be looking at a higher level form of configuration for this?
Not sure if I follow the question. The examples we provide in the doc include things such as identity verified with an external IDC server. That's one. Typically, for the authorization, I would expect, again, this is back to my experience, that to be combined with authorization patterns expressed using something like CEL, right? But that doesn't mean you could mix and combine with the other methods as well. You could have technically like an OIDC token that you verify on a per request basis, and then you verify authorization with the Kubernetes authorization system. There's
that makes sense to me. I guess what I was saying is my very rough understanding of this diagram is that for every identity rule, we could be looking at a reference to an identity provider, and like that, if you have to configure a different identity provider or similar for each identity rule, that feels like it could get complicated. Whereas if you had something that was attached to your gateway, whatever implementation at the top, right, and said, this is what it means to be, OIDC provider, and then in your rule you just have like a name that's associated with, or a type that's associated, a custom type, a domain. I don't know how we do that, but like if you can reduce the level of config needed in each rule to express this is a custom kind of identity that isn't core, and but this is this was configured at a higher level for my entire implementation. I don't know. I think I'm getting too far into the weeds, and this is something that can be discussed further. But
No, I think I'm following now. Yeah, and you have a point. I mean, for example, for OIDC, usually the minimum set of configuration that ones need to integrate an OIDC provider is just an issuer URL, right? Let's say if the implementation supports OIDC discovery, you don't need anything other than that, right? So just the issuer URL. It does sound a bit overkill, right? If you have an auth scheme with an identity rule that points to an OIDC identity provider resource, and the only thing that goes in the OIDC identity provider resource is an issuer URL, right? Whereas maybe for other types of identity verification methods, right, other methods of verifying identity, you may need a larger set of fields to configure.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Philip?
Yeah, so all of this, like the auth scheme, auth rule, identity rule, are these all new objects, or is this more just a logical diagram?
It's more yeah. It's just a logical diagram of the concept. The CRDs here are the backend CRD, right? The auth scheme CRD, and then the ones you see in yellow in the diagram.
So,
But auth scheme would be something new.
Unless we decide that could be done inside of the access policy one, which is what Lior was suggesting.
so Philip, I think I'm not. I think it connects to one of the points you made during KubeCon and before, like where you would want to have these points of like extensibility, like the points where we plug in some stuff.
Yeah.
Like, and I think one of the things that, again, like you're probably familiar with, right? Like, for example, with HTTP route, you have an extension ref, right? And then you extend, and then within this extension, you can do some, nice things. So one of the things that I think like that I think could be useful here is like, okay, if we take, because right, as we unpacked the functionalities and what is provider specific, what other providers want or not want to implement, whatever. So we can understand that, I mean, not understand, again, we're all exploring this right now, but like that we more and more abstract this away, and maybe it's a good place to see whether we can just have an extension point from the other CRD, like the access policy in this case, where we could just like have this hook of like, okay, now this is an extension point to an ODC provider, or this is an extension point to something else, or you know what I mean? So
Lior, but please let me step back a little bit and make sure that the use case makes sense to everybody here, right? So rather than the solution, right? We've been so much, it's so long now that we've been discussing the solution. But yeah, thanks, Rob. You have another item in the agenda, so yeah. Does it make sense, having an extension point for integrating no IDC server? And what about the cell authorization, a way to express authorization using common expression language? Is that something that resonates to more people here?
for me personally, I think I would say it definitely makes sense to have an extension point, period. But specifically for either cell, like I know cell is very common and people are using it, so it definitely is useful. For IDC, I think it's even more. But yeah, I guess yeah, basically the answer is yes. I'm not sure if like specifically, for example, if you would ask me, is it useful to have it for RBAC, I would probably say no, but obviously it's biased based on my opinion. But yeah, I think having an extension point is useful, period. It doesn't really matter what is this extension.
But do you need a new extension point? Like, I mean, is it overloading to talk about using policy, or is it reusing to talk about using policy, for example? And like backend, like, is that backend a gateway? Like, what exactly is the backend?
Backend is the resource that we discussed that is representing, in our point, a workload, in our point, a tool, right, or an agentic workload running outside of Kube. Like obviously we're
like an MCP server, for example.
Yeah.
Okay, but what's the Kubernetes object that represents that backend? Is it a gateway API object, and what is it?
It's the new backend object we talked about.
The new object.
Yeah, if you remember, I mean, there's some proposals in this repo, but also I think it came up in the KubeCon discussion. I don't like referencing to the KubeCon. I remember just you being there.
Yeah, no, I thought when you guys were talking backend, that was a generic. And when you said backend, you meant, there'd be a gateway or there'd be an egress gate, like that there was a generic. But you're saying there's an actual backend object that would be called backend.
Yeah, I mean, the way I think of backends in gateway API terminology is you have a gateway layer, which I generally think of as a front end, whether that's for ingress or we haven't defined it as much, but for egress too, I would imagine similar. Then you have a routing layer, and then you have kind of a backend, which is most commonly service, but also inference pool, etc. This has generally been a group of pods inside a Kubernetes cluster. For egress, a backend probably means a definition of, in this case, a tool, or, this is all a very good transition into Keith's topic, which is coming up next.
I'll try
That's
to
like a
capture
service or an
and
application or
summarize.
something. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll try to capture and summarize some of the things we discussed here in the pull request. Because, yeah, that was interesting. Thank you.
I don't think Keith's back though, right? So I think Keith said he'll be right back, and I don't think he is back. Maybe I'm wrong.
Oh, yeah, no, you're right.
I've been seeing him.
That was Hayan.
Since Keith is not here, maybe I can ask a follow-up question regarding our scheme. Because currently the access policy, the target ref, we only allow backend. For the auth scheme key design, I feel like we don't need to define the auth scheme for every backend. It probably should be a more higher level, like HTTP route level, or maybe even like a gateway level. So yeah, just want to clarify that's my understanding, right? The intent, ideally, we do not need to redefine auth scheme for every backend.
Yeah, I mean, the target refs, they define the context, right? You want that policy or that scheme in this case, to be applied, right? Mm-hmm. So arguably, even the access policy, if you wanted, you could somebody could make the point that you could target a gateway as well, right? And say every traffic that passes through this gateway, regardless of the endpoint, the backend that it's going to be sent to, I want these rules to be enforced, right? We collectively, decide that the backend was the thing that made the most sense for the access policy. So I followed for the auth scheme, right? So it's the finest grain that we have in the network topology that we're working with right now. But arguably, yes, I mean, we could work with different kind of resources as well. Network resources, it could be gateway, it could be the HP route, for example.
Thanks.
Lior?
I just wanted to let Keith take over. So yeah, we have no thought. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry about that, folks. I'm got double booked this morning and was trying to be in two places at once. But
Keith, I'll just give a. So just before you joined, I mean, there was something that could get you in this as well, which you could maybe give a short sentence. Is like there was a question about exactly what backend is and represents, and yeah, like basically, kind of maybe even slightly to the purpose of it. So I guess you could.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great question. And for me. So context, I'm thinking about this a lot in the context of the working group AI Gateway. And so the way I think about backend is really going all the way back 2 to 3 years ago when we talked about, like in Gateway API Core, when we talked about the front end and back end roles of the service resource, where the service resource has both a virtual IP that a client will target. And then there's also the back end role, and that's the front end role, is that sort of virtual IP that clients address. And then the back end role as a bag of endpoints that can be load balanced across. From a more classic proxy nomenclature, you could say that maybe in a way is that the front end of the service is more in the routing domain, and the back end of the service is in the load balancing domain. And so I think of this backend resource as being firmly in that second box. The backend resource describes, especially in the context, even in the context of FQDNs, It describes the load balancing bit where you've got a bag of endpoints or envoy hosts or destinations that you are load balancing connections across after the routing step has ended. Um, and so, in the context of an auth policy, um, I think a lot of the times, uh, well, I'll say putting my Istio hat on, I have an open question here in my PR and working group AI Gateway that one of the things that feels missing, and this gets to the auth policy question, is a front end aspect of this. When somebody is addressing trying to send traffic to this backend, where does the auth step happen? From what I've seen, if I'm understand, like just from my experience, that tends to happen before load balancing, before we even have addressed the backend. And so I see maybe this tension between trying to use the backend resource for front end things because we don't actually have a decoupled front end resource outside of service today. So I'll pause there. Hopefully that is relevant, Lior, Ingi, and others who are in that off conversation. Apologies that I don't have the full context because I was out.
Yeah, sorry. I guess
yeah.
Philip doesn't end up. I mean, yeah, the question came.
Yeah, so that's fine. So if you kind of translate that to Gateway API, right? You have the gateway that has listeners that sort of have that front end thing, and you have the route that sends to something which you're calling a back end, right? So, and you actually raised exactly the issue that I kind of wonder about, because the discussion here is about putting an auth policy, or as I think of it, some sort of authorization control on the back end. But it seems to me like it's actually better to put it on the route to the back end because you could have different authorization depending on how you reach it, right? Like it's sort of like if you're adding it to the back, it's almost like expanding what a service is or something to have an authorized service and an unauthorized service versus having the path to the thing be authorized, have an authorization step. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. So in Mesh World, in Mesh World, we look at it slightly differently, where because there's these transparent proxies routing on behalf of the application, like the application, the service front end itself has auth policy on it because a user wants to be able to say everything that goes to my service has this policy. Like I don't want any delete requests coming to my service unless you come from this identity as a example.
But in a mesh, you might, yeah.
Well, I was going to say in Gateway, it's sort of hard, right? Because if your only thing you can sort of plug into is the route to the back end, that's not that. Well, I guess it sort of depends on what the user's looking for. If you have if the only way if you only care about north-south traffic coming from your gateway to your application, then the route is sufficient because the gateway is that north-south proxy. You don't have a way without a mesh to really do east-west, and I think that's just probably maybe not a limitation, but just sort of the scope of that north-south gateway API role, if that makes sense.
But this is one of the recommendations I would make when you're talking about application to application, right? But fundamentally, agentic traffic is one application talking to another. And they may be talking in the same cluster. They may be talking from one cluster to another. And I think we need to rethink east-west versus north-south. And actually, if an application talks to another application, then it goes through a gateway, right? And that way you have a reliable data path, whether you're talking about two things in the same cluster or two things in different clusters. For an application to talk to the other application, it talks to that front end piece that you're talking about, and it gets routed to a different back end rather than just if you're in the same cluster, it's east-west, it works differently.
We should talk more about that. I did just see a time check emoji, and so want to make sure. And then there's one topic after mine, so I want to get through the rest of my topic really quickly. But the short answer I have about that is this is why Istio has waypoints serving sort of as cluster local gateways for applications. I think it's why some folks are trying to have gateway like do this cluster local gateway thing for service. And even outside of those efforts, I've worked in places where we hairpinned, where we sent traffic out from inside the cluster out to the gateway and back to be able to get authorization policy. And I think that's not ideal, but that is a valid way to get that sort of effect without a mesh. Again, putting my mesh hat on, I think that's one of the primary values that we provide, but we should follow up and figure out how we want to model that from an API perspective. Talking about this proposal more frequently, the main reason I brought this up is because to this group is because I love to get people's feedback on the proposal. When I looked at the current work happening for the backend in this group and Agentic networking, it was very focused on MCP as a backend and had MCP as a specific backend, which makes sense because that is this group's scope. But I wanted to, I think for a more generic backend resource that can do general egress, having an MCP backend granularity is not doesn't quite fit. And so what I've done in this proposal is I've tried to integrate all the MCP specific config from the Agentic proposal and make it still available, but with a different semantic and different modeling. So instead of an MCP backend, I'm hearing some crosstalk. I'm not sure where it's coming from. But when it comes to instead of having it be an MCP backend, what I've done instead is to have a MCP protocol on the back end. And so for a given backend import, you can say this port has this protocol that would be MCP. And then there's also a field for protocol specific options. And so in the MCP case, that's where you could put the MCP path, you could put the MCP version, et cetera, et cetera. And so I wanted to get a sense for how that model feels to this group, because I think that for a more generic proposal, we'd have to do something like that versus having a top-level backend, like MCP backend resource or a backend field type. There you go. Lior.
Yeah, overall, and I guess a bit probably Rob can walk us down the screen a little bit, but like overall, I think this makes sense to me. I think there was as well one comment on the Agentic proposal where like, okay, some things can be generalized, but like, yeah, I did not have a chance to look at the specifics, but like the way you describe it, I think it definitely makes sense, like having a protocol and then potential future options. So overall, yes, I would like to understand what else is within this backend. Like, but yeah, I'll stop here if someone else has other opinions. But if not, like, just walk us through the rest.
So we can extend like ARM backends, right? Calling AI service, like it's another like a egress use case to call ARM models.
Yes, so that we haven't gotten that far proposal wise. First, we want to just flesh out that backend resource semantics first. But I think one of the things you'll probably do is have like an LLM protocol, and then within protocol specific options, allow different implementations to have different backends, Vertex, Azure OpenAI, Bedrock, etc. within that stack for different auth or different.
It's like the API more like a not HTTP, but like an API level, like a protocol, like whether it's like a OpenAI chat completion protocol, like or Anthropic, like a message API, right? These kind of like
right. So at a high level, we'd have LLM generically, and then different implementations for whatever backends and integrations they support would be able to maybe have some opaque section in implementation specific config, or no, it's a protocol backend protocol options, and they'd be able to put either like vendor prefixed protocols there, like Istio.io/MC /Azure with their options, or maybe we standardize on a couple within Gateway API or Working Group API Gateway or what have you. But that's sort of the abstraction I came up with for how to make this. Again, there are about hundreds of different LLM backends, it feels like at this point. So wanted to be able to have a strongly typed way to frame this that still work with like TLS or other things, but still give flexibility to implementations to have a bunch of different integrations. There's also last thing I'll say before I hand it off to the next agenda topic is there's a discussion that I started on the scoping of the backend resource. I don't know if you folks in the Agentic group have thought about that much, but I think we should discuss a bit about the persona model and what persona owns a backend, because we're working in Istio, we've seen different personas in different organizations have conflicting views of who owns the backend resource, and it might be worth splitting it out into two different resources, one for the admin, one for the namespace, like the application developer. So I would love to hear more thoughts on that as well. Lior?
Yeah, let me remember what I wanted to ask. 1 second. Yeah, I don't remember, so I'll just skip it.
All right, feel free to follow up with me in Slack or the Working Group AI Gateway channel. Go ahead.
Yeah, so like basically, is this backend anticipated to be a target for policies mainly?
That's a good question. Backend policies, maybe. I don't immediately see why not. I think we do need to narrow down the semantic, though. To my point earlier about auth, does a target ref on a back end mean that maybe it just means that every request to this back end will have this policy, and but only a mesh can implement that. So like I don't know what it means to have a policy apply to a back end outside of a mesh context if we don't guarantee all traffic goes through a gateway first. That's, I think, one of the core questions I got. And then I saw a question in the chat about the personas discussion. I have a comment in the PR, as well as a section around scope of the backend resource where that discussion is being kicked off. So I linked the PR in the agenda. Feel free we can continue discussion there.
Perfect.
Thanks.
Thanks,
Cool. Thanks, Keith. Phil, I think you're up next, and you've got 7 minutes. So good luck.
Yeah, I don't need a whole ton of time. So I did, after our discussion last time, I did make this document. My idea was, what we need is a sort of common diagram that we work off of. I found one of the most powerful things in Gateway API to be that sort of initial diagram that showed the roles and the objects, right? And so I thought having something common to sort of talk about how we're approaching it would be worthwhile. And only really 2 people, commented within it. David and Guy here. I think that the comments were relatively positive, with some, like, oh, we should be more specific about auth, or, what does it mean, for a processor. But I don't know if it's helpful. Again, I don't know if the fact that only 2 people commented means that it just kind of died on the vine and, we should forget about this, or if I should try to do something else. Again, I kind of made a presumption like that, things like auth and stuff would happen based on routes. Back to our discussion with Keith, right? That, how you access a backend, like a route, could determine what kind of authorization you want, right? Like if you're accessing from an internal source, you might be using an internal authorization thing that's shared across an organization, whereas, if you're doing something from the outside, you might use a totally different authorization method, right? And I was trying to sort of reuse a lot of, gateway things, but make sure to leave certain things as implementation specific. So you'd create something that would be an auth policy, which would be fairly standard, but how you actually did authorization could be completely specific. And you'd have a processor policy, but what you were doing in terms of guardrails or semantic caching or whatever else could be sort of, up to the implementation. And you could even use outside tools that were things not designed to be used in this place, but some guardrail vendor or open source project, you could just plug it in by using a policy object. And I kind of left open whether we wanted a bunch of discussion points, like if we wanted protocol specific things like an MCP route, introduce a new kind of route. Based on the earlier discussion, I would submit that it's probably a good idea, even though MCP is one of those things that's kind of currently the hotness. And, I had a coworker just yesterday say, oh, MCP's dead. It's being replaced by X. And it's like, yeah, okay. But we have to accept the fact that MCP is new enough that it could literally be not used by anyone 2 years from now. But on the other hand, I think we have value in doing something like protocol specifics so that as new protocols come along, we still learned something from doing MCP route. Anyway, this was my thing. I don't know if if I should treat it as kind of dead because it only got so much reaction, or if I should do something more or different.
So
go ahead.
Yeah, no, this is great. Sorry, I missed leaving any comments on it. My view here is that one, I'll address my own perspective on MCP route or MCP as a protocol. I would love to, as far as we can in this API, avoid getting too specific on protocols. So like one of the things I really liked about auth policy or that concept is you can basically describe, I want this thing, this identity to be able to talk to this tool. And it allows for different underlying protocols, which feels very, very helpful. And I'd like to continue that where we can. I think the idea of tools is probably going to stick around for a while, but the underlying, yeah, maybe, but there's so what I've gone off the rails here, but there are other protocols that are also tool adjacent, is what I would say. But that wasn't really my main point. So I should not spend too much time there because I want to give time for other people to talk. My main point was when we've talked about auth policies, authorization in Gateway API, one of the things that I have really, believed in is that routing to applications or tools or backends or whatever we want to call it is often going to be different than auth, right? You want your authorization to be able to, especially if it's a policy like this of this can talk to that, to be distinct from routing configuration. So what I would rather say is that this auth is either, just implicitly implemented by the gateway, regardless of route attachment, or attached to specific gateways, but not attached at the routing layer. I think that's a small detail, but that would be my preference here.
But the route tells you something about where the connection is coming from, right? I mean, you could have two different routes to the same thing on two different gateways, like one on a private local network that is inside your enterprise and one coming from the internet. And you could have completely different authorization policies based on where you're coming from, right?
I don't know, maybe folks disagree with me, but I don't know how common, maybe it is more common, but I'll just say in Istio, we don't support that. And haven't had again, maybe it's the mesh context versus the gateway context. I'll acknowledge that. But in my mind, I think of auth as being something that you typically want to be oriented with the thing that it, like the service owner is saying, here's the auth policy for my service, regardless of where the traffic comes from. And you're losing request attributes or 5-tuple attributes to decide whether or not that request is authorized or not.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I see it fairly frequently, where there are different trust domains, either within an enterprise or, even just a, 2-layer web application has stuff that faces the internet, stuff that's maybe on a private, network, and, requests are different depending on where they're coming from, and, and also authorization has to be super broad. I mean, there'll be people trying to reuse, Active Directory or, any kind of damn thing for authorization, just because their organization uses it in some weird, archaic way.
I think we have largely run out of time here. Sanjeev, you've got a hand, so I'll let you wrap this up. But I think we're at the end of today's meeting. So Sanjeev, any final thoughts?
Okay, just through 2 one-liners then. I do agree that auth needs to have source awareness, and more on that later. But I think that if we go back to the goal of this work, which is make agentic networking, make Kubernetes a better platform for agentic networking, we should always keep that in mind as to what particular attributes do we want to cross-filter so that these features don't get in the way of developers rather than assisting them. Because I know this is a bit of this might take time, and maybe we should have a separate topic in the next call, but it feels like we are embedding application level constructs into the infrastructure, which may have this persona conflict issue that was alluded to earlier. So some of these should be seen from that perspective. Anyway, we can discuss more specifics, and I'll also might comment on Phil's document later.
And I'll say that's also one reason why I like the idea of having a separate policy, is you could have a separate owner for auth policy than the application owner or the gateway owner or the whatever else owner, right?
Yeah, +1. Awesome. Well, thanks everyone. Great discussions today. Lots of docs and PRs to follow up on. Yeah, we'll see you all online. Have a great one.
All right. Thanks, guys.